Story 1. The Strange Man in the Woods. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere with your friends that makes you feel invincible. It's like the world shrinks down to just the few of you, a small self-contained bubble of laughter and camaraderie. That's how we felt when we decided to go camping that weekend. Just for friends, a couple of tents, and the open wilderness. We had no idea that something, or rather someone, would break that bubble and leave us asking questions about everything we thought we knew about being safe in the wild. The idea was easy. Drive out to a faraway campground, set up camp, and spend a few days hiking, fishing, and forgetting about the stress of everyday life. No phones, no internet, just us and nature. On the day of the trip, the sky was a perfect blue. The road went through forests and past shiny lakes. We played music, sang along, and laughed at silly jokes. Just the kind of carefree road trip you'd expect when you're with your closest friends. We got to the campsite in the late afternoon. It was more far away than we had thought. It was tucked away in a valley. There were no other campers around, just an empty ranger station at the entrance and a few old signs marking the trails. The fact that we were alone didn't bother us. In fact, we liked it. It was exactly what we were looking for, a place to get away from everything. We set up our tents in a clearing near the edge of the forest. It was close to a small stream that made a constant, peaceful background noise. The sun was starting to set, and the air was filled with the smell of pine trees and damp earth. It was perfect. After setting up camp, we gathered around a fire pit that Ethan, our friend who loved camping, had quickly put together. We cooked hot dogs, shared stories, and let the peace of the wilderness wash over us. As the night came and the stars came out, we felt like we were the only people in the world. It was exactly the kind of escape we had all needed. But that feeling of peace didn't last long. It was around 9 p.m. when we first saw him. We were deep into a conversation about some dumb thing that had happened back at school when Ethan suddenly stopped talking. His eyes were looking at something beyond the firelight. His face, which had been happy with laughter just moments before, now had a look of confusion. "What is it?" I asked, turning to look where he was looking. Standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a heavy jacket and jeans, even though the weather was warm. His hair was long and messy, and his face was partly hidden by the darkness, but I could see his eyes shining in the firelight. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching us. For a moment, none of us spoke. Seeing him was so unexpected, so out of place, that it took a second for my brain to understand what I was seeing. We were miles away from the nearest town, and the campground was empty. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice careful. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at us with a look that made my skin crawl. There was something wrong about him, something that set off warning bells in my mind, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. "Can we help you, Avery?" Always the polite one asked, though I could hear the nervousness in her voice. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man stepped forward into the light. His face came into view, and I felt a shock of worry. He looked older than I had first thought. His skin was pale and thin, with deep lines cut into his face. His eyes were hollow, almost lifeless, and his lips were twisted into a faint, disturbing smile. "No need to worry," he said, his voice low and rough. "Just passing through." Passing through. It didn't make any sense. There was nothing to pass through to. This place was far away, alone, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here, unless they had a specific place in mind. "Are you camping nearby?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the tension in his body. The man's smile got wider, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just enjoying the night," he replied. His gaze moved from Ethan to the rest of us. "It's peaceful out here, isn't it?" None of us knew what to say. There was something about him that made my stomach twist with worry. But I didn't want to be rude. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a stranger, probably out for a walk, like he said. But the way he was looking at us, like he was studying us, made me feel like we were prey. "Well, we're just having a quiet night ourselves," Ethan said, clearly trying to end the conversation. "We'll let you get back to your walk." The man nodded, that same disturbing smile still on his face. "Of course, you folks have a good night." With that, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. We watched him go, the firelight flickering on our faces, none of us speaking until we were sure he was gone. "That was weird," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "Weird." "That was straight up creepy," Avery replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Maybe he's just a local," Ethan offered, though he didn't sound like he believed it. "Some people like to camp alone, maybe," I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The mood had changed. The feeling of peace we'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a worry that none of us could ignore. We tried to go back to our conversation, to pretend that meeting the stranger hadn't shaken us. But it was no use. The stranger's presence hung over us like a dark cloud. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves in the wind made us jump. Finally, we decided to call it a night. We put out the fire, packed away the food, and went back to our tents. Each of us cast worried glances toward the dark woods as we zipped ourselves in. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that the man was just some strange person who liked to wander around the woods at night. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the fabric ceiling of the tent, I couldn't shake the image of his eyes, cold, hollow, and completely empty of any warmth or humanity. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That disturbing smile and the way he had looked at us, like he knew something we didn't. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the last we'd see of him. The next morning, over breakfast, we made jokes about the creepy woodsman and tried to convince ourselves that we had overreacted. But the truth was, none of us could forget how uneasy he had made us feel. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, doing our best to enjoy the beautiful surroundings. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and for a while, it was easy to forget about the strange man we had met the night before. But as the day went on and the shadows began to get longer, that feeling of worry started to creep back in. We returned to the campsite in the late afternoon, tired but in good spirits. Ethan and Thomas started gathering firewood while Avery and I prepared dinner. It was shaping up to be another pleasant evening, until we noticed something strange. The first sign that something was wrong came when Ethan went to get the lantern from his tent and found that it wasn't where he'd left it. He searched the tent from top to bottom, but it was gone. "Are you sure you didn't leave it somewhere else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm positive," he replied, his forehead wrinkled with worry. "I left it right here next to my sleeping bag." We all searched the campsite, but the lantern was nowhere to be found. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily lose, and none of us had moved it. But we tried to brush it off as one of those things that just happen. when you're camping, even though the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. As the sun began to set, we lit the fire and gathered around it, trying to ignore the growing darkness around us. But the feeling had changed again. The easygoing friendship was replaced by a tense silence. And then, as the last light of day faded, we heard it. A rustling in the bushes just beyond the clearing. We all froze, our eyes looking toward the sound. It was subtle, just the faintest noise, like something moving through the underbrush. But in the stillness of the night, it was impossible to miss. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. There was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. But as the flashlight's beam moved across the trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face, half hidden behind a tree, watching us. It was the man from the night before. He was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, his pale face barely visible in the shadows. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just watched us with those same cold, hollow eyes. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Yeah, I saw him. What is he doing?" Avery asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Thomas replied, his voice tight with fear. "But I don't like it." We all stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The man didn't move, didn't come any closer. He just stood there watching us, like he was waiting for something. Finally, Ethan spoke up, his voice firm. "We need to get out of here." We didn't argue. We quickly packed up what we could, our movements frantic and messy, as we kept glancing toward the trees. The man was still there, still watching, but he didn't make any move to stop us. We piled into the car, the fear thick in the air, and sped out of the campsite, leaving the man and the forest behind. We didn't stop driving until we were well out of the mountains, the lights of the nearest town coming into view. The tension in the car was thick. None of us dared to speak until we were sure we were far enough away. "What the hell was that?" Avery finally asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But I didn't. Want to stick around to find out?" "Do you think he was following us?" Thomas asked, his voice tinged with fear. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. "I don't know. But there was something about him, something that wasn't right." We all fell silent again, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The meeting with the stranger had shaken us to our core, and the questions it raised were too many to count. Who was he? Why was he out there in the middle of nowhere? And what did he want from us? We never found out. We never went back to that campsite, and we never spoke of the meeting again. But the memory of that man, his cold, hollow eyes, his disturbing smile still haunts me to this day. There's one thing I'm sure of. I'll never go camping in a remote area again. Story 2. The Whisper in the Night. I was looking forward to this camping trip, a chance to escape the noise of the city and spend some quality time together as a family. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, just me, my wife, and our 2 kids out in nature. Away from the stress of everyday life, we found a campground that was supposed to be quiet and peaceful, tucked away in a national park with a beautiful river running nearby. It seemed like the perfect spot. The drive out was exactly as we expected. The kids were chattering excitedly in the back seat as we wound our way through the mountains. The trees towered above us, their leaves casting spotted shadows on the road. The air was crisp and cool, a welcome change from the hot heat of the city. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip toward the horizon. The campground was even better than we'd hoped, spacious, with plenty of room for the kids to run around and only a few other campers scattered about, far enough away that it felt like we had the place to ourselves. We picked a spot near the edge of the woods, close enough to the river that we could hear the gentle rush of water in the distance. My wife and I put up the tent while the kids explored the area, their laughter echoing through the trees. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in colors of pink and orange, and the smell of pine filled the air. It was perfect, the kind of evening that makes you feel like everything is right with the world. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The kids were all smiles, their faces glowing in the firelight, and I remember feeling a deep sense of happiness. This was what life was all about. These simple moments, surrounded by the people you love. But as the fire died down and the stars began to peek through the canopy of trees, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, just a slight worry that crept up on me as I stared into the flickering flames. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the usual jitters that come with being out in the middle of nowhere. But that feeling of worry wouldn't go away. The kids were exhausted from a day of running around, so we tucked them into their sleeping bags in the tent and zipped it up tight. My wife and I stayed by the fire for a while longer, enjoying the quiet, the crackle of the last embers, the rustling of the wind through the trees. The world felt peaceful, almost dreamlike. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost impossible to tell apart from the natural noises of the forest. But it grew louder as I tried hard to listen. Footsteps, slow, careful, crunching softly on the gravel path that wound through the campground. I glanced at my wife, but she seemed lost in thought, staring into the dying fire. I didn't want to scare her, so I kept quiet, telling myself it was probably just another camper returning to their tent. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew closer, heavier, as if whoever it was taking their time, moving with purpose. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, but I couldn't see anything. Just the trees, the shadows, the faint outline of the tent where our kids were sleeping, and then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. I felt exposed, vulnerable, sitting there in the dark, with only the remains of the fire between us and whoever or whatever was out there. I opened my mouth to say something, to suggest that we go into the tent. But before I could, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of fabric rustling, like someone was brushing against the side of the tent. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The tent was just a few feet away, the faint outline of it visible in the dim light. But the sound was clear. Someone was outside our tent, moving around it, maybe even touching it. My wife must have sensed my tension because she looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. "What is it?" she whispered. I shook my head, not wanting to frighten her, but the fear in her eyes told me she already knew something was wrong. "I think there's someone out there," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. She didn't say anything, just nodded, her hand reaching for mine. We both sat there, listening, our ears trying hard to catch any sound. But the forest had gone silent. Again, the only noise, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a long moment, we stayed like that, our breaths shallow, our hearts pounding. But when nothing happened, when the footsteps didn't return, I began to relax, telling myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe it was an animal, my wife suggested, her voice trembling slightly. Yeah, I agreed, though I didn't believe it. Probably just a raccoon or something. But the worry stayed, eating at the back of my mind. We decided to call it a night, putting out the fire and going back to the safety of the tent. The kids were sound asleep, their breathing soft and steady, not knowing about the tension in the air. We crawled into our sleeping bags, zipping them up tight. The thin fabric the only barrier between us and the darkness outside. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent a jolt of fear through me, my mind creating images of shadows lurking just outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. But eventually, tiredness took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up to the sound of the zipper on the tent being pulled open. For a moment, I was confused, my mind struggling to process what was happening. The tent was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the trees. But the sound of that zipper, slow, careful, sent a bolt of terror through me. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes wide as I scanned the tent. My wife was already awake, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with fear. The kids were still asleep, not knowing about the danger. The zipper stopped halfway, leaving the tent partly open, and I could feel the cool night air seeping in. But there was no movement, no sound from outside. I reached for the flashlight, my hands trembling as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the inside of the tent. But I couldn't bring myself to point it toward the opening. What if there was someone or something standing there? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Stay here," I whispered to my wife, my voice shaking. She nodded, her hand gripping mine tightly, her eyes begging me not to go. But I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was outside to make the next move. I slowly turned the flashlight toward the opening, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake the kids. The light cut through the darkness, showing the partly open flap of the tent. But there was nothing there, just the empty darkness beyond. I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders sagging with relief. Maybe it really was just an animal, something small that had been curious and decided to investigate. I was about to close the tent and go back to bed when I heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible, but definitely human. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. The voice was low, rough, and filled with a quiet threat that made my skin crawl. I turned the flashlight back toward the opening, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it steady. But there was still nothing there. I didn't move, didn't breathe, my eyes locked on the darkness beyond the tent. The whisper came again, closer this time, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. "Let me in." I could feel my wife's grip on my arm tighten, her nails digging into my skin. She was as terrified as I was, maybe more so. But we didn't dare make a sound, didn't dare move. And then, without warning, the tent shook violently, as if someone or something had slammed into it from the outside. The kids woke up with a start, their cries filling the tent as they scrambled out of their sleeping bags. Wide-eyed with fear, my wife tried to calm them, her voice trembling as she told them that everything was okay. But we both knew it wasn't. The tent shook again, the fabric straining against the force, and I could hear the sound of heavy breathing, low and rough, just outside. "Stay here," I whispered again, my voice shaking as I grabbed the camping knife from my pack. "I'm going to see what it is." "No," my wife begged, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go out there." But I didn't have a choice. I had to protect my family, had to find out what was threatening us. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever was waiting outside, and slowly unzipped the tent the rest of the way. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I stepped out, the flashlight beam lighting up the campground. The forest was silent, the only sound the rapid pounding of my heart in my ears. I scanned the area, the light bouncing off the trees, the shadows twisting and turning in the beam. But there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything that could have been responsible for the attack on the tent. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again. The whisper coming from the trees. "Let me in." My heart raced as I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the dense underbrush, the tall pines, and the thick darkness beyond. But I could feel it, the presence of something lurking just out of sight, watching me. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking, and ducked back into the tent, zipping it up as quickly as I could. My wife and kids were huddled together, their faces pale with fear, and I could see the terror in their eyes. "We're leaving," I whispered, my voice firm now. We didn't waste any time. We packed up the tent and our gear as quickly as we could, our movements frantic and desperate. The kids were too scared to cry, their wide eyes fixed on us as we worked, their small bodies trembling with fear. The entire time, I could feel the presence of whatever had been outside, lurking in the darkness, watching us. But it didn't make another move, didn't make a sound, as if it was waiting for the right moment to strike. We finished packing, and I grabbed the keys to the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. We piled into the car, my wife holding the kids close, her eyes scanning the darkness outside the windows. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the night, and we sped out of the campground, the tires kicking up gravel as we went. The road wound through the trees, the forest closing in around us. But I didn't dare slow down. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with what had just happened. The voice, the shaking tent, the sense of being watched. It all felt like a nightmare, something too terrifying to be real. But it was real. It had happened, and we had barely escaped. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were miles away from that place. We finally pulled into a rest stop, the kids falling asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the night's ordeal. My wife and I sat in the car, the silence between us, heavy with the unspoken terror of what we had experienced. "What was it?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't know, I still don't. But I do know that something was out there, something that didn't belong, something that wanted to get inside. And I know that we were lucky to get away. I don't know what would have happened if I had let it in. And I hope I never find out. Story 3, The Disappearing Friends Finding. The perfect camping spot brings a unique sense of excitement. A place that feels clean and untouched, where you can completely disconnect and lose yourself in the natural surround. That's what we were looking for when we set out on that trip. We wanted to escape the noise, the crowds, and the constant buzz of technology. We wanted to be alone, have peace, and the chance to reconnect with ourselves and each other. We found that spot, at least we thought we did. It was late summer, the kind of warm, golden days that make you feel like you're living in a postcard. We had decided to take a weekend trip to a remote lake we'd heard about through word of mouth. It was supposed to be beautiful, surrounded by thick forest and far from the nearest town. The kind of place that feels like it's just for you, hidden, away from the rest of the world. The drive out was long, taking us deeper into the mountains than we'd ever been before. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, winding through thick stands of pine and birch. The air grew cooler, fresher, and the scent of the forest filled the car. We parked the car at the edge of a small clearing where the trees opened up just enough to give us a view of the lake. It was perfect, calm, still, the surface of the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There wasn't another soul in sight, just the four of us in the wilderness. We set up our tents close to the water's edge, unpacking our gear and settling in for what we thought would be a peaceful weekend. The lake was calm. It felt like we had stepped into another world, far removed from the chaos of everyday life. That first evening was everything we had hoped for. We cooked dinner over a campfire, shared stories, and watched the sunset over the lake. The sky turned from orange to pink to deep purple. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a blanket of twinkling lights. It was the kind of night that makes you feel small in the best possible way, like you're a part of something much bigger. We stayed up late, talking and laughing, the fire crackling between us. There was a sense of happiness, of rightness, that made us all feel like we had found something special. We were disconnected from the world, but connected to each other, to nature, to something deeper. But as the fire burned low and the night grew colder, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. A sense that something wasn't quite right. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just a vague worry that made me glance over my shoulder more than once, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight. I told myself it was nothing. After all, we were miles from anywhere, and there was nothing out there but trees and animals. What could possibly go wrong? The next morning dawned clear and bright, the lake glistening in the early light. We woke up feeling refreshed, the worry from the night before forgotten in the daylight. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking along the shoreline and swimming in the cool, clear water. It was everything we had hoped for, a perfect escape. But as the day wore on, little things started to feel off. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming the day before, now felt somehow darker. The trees pressing in closer, their shadows longer. The birds, which had filled the air with their songs, had fallen silent, leaving an eerie stillness that settled over the lake. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling of worry crept back in, stronger this time, eating at the edges of my mind. Later that evening, we were sitting around the campfire again, the sky turning a deep shade of blue as the sun set. Mark had gone back to the tent to grab a jacket, and the rest of us were talking, the firelight flickering on our faces. But when Mark returned, he looked different. There was a tension in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't say anything, just sat down and stared into the fire, his expression distant. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just ... I thought I saw something in the woods. Probably nothing." The way he said it, though, made my skin prickle. "What did you see?" He shook his head, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't know. Probably just a deer or something. It's nothing." But I could tell he didn't believe that, and neither did I. We tried to move past it, to enjoy the evening like we had the night before, but the mood had shifted. The conversation became awkward, forced, and every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. Finally, Emily suggested we turn in early. No one argued. We put out the fire and headed for the tents. But as I crawled into my sleeping bag, the worry gnawed at me, making it impossible to relax. The forest, which had been so silent earlier, was now alive with noise. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. But beneath it all there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. A faint, almost impossible to hear hum that seemed to vibrate through the air, making my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest made louder by my imagination. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that didn't belong. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the outside of the tent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, steady and careful, coming from the side of the tent closest to the woods. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She stirred, groggy and confused. "Hear what?" The tapping stopped for a moment. There was only silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. Then, just as I was about to brush it off as a dream, it started again. This time, louder, more insistent. Sarah sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "But it's coming from outside." We sat there, frozen, listening to the sound. It was careful, like someone or something was trying to get our attention. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking, and flicked it on. The beam lit up the inside of the tent. "Should we look?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay put, to ignore it. But the curiosity, the need to know what was out there, was too strong. "Stay here," I whispered, my voice firmer than I felt. "I'll check it out," before she could protest. I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out. The night was dark, but the moonlight provided just enough light to see. I turned the flashlight toward the source of the sound, my heart in my throat. But there was nothing there, just the empty woods, silent and still. I stepped out of the tent, the cold air biting at my skin, and shone the light around the campsite. Everything was as we'd left it, the fire pit, the chairs, the other tent where Mark and Emily were sleeping. Except, as I moved closer to their tent, I noticed something strange. The flap of their tent was open, the zipper undone, flapping slightly. In the breeze, "Mark, Emily." I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I moved closer, shining the flashlight into their tent, my stomach twisting with dread. But it was empty. Their sleeping bags were there, the blankets still rumpled as if they'd just gotten up. But there was no sign of them. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. "Sarah, get out here," I called, louder this time. She scrambled out of the tent, her face pale with fear. "What is it?" "They're gone," I said, my voice hollow. "Mark and Emily, they're gone." We searched the campsite, calling their names, our voices echoing through the trees. But there was no sign of them, nothing to show where they'd gone. Panic set in quickly. Story 5. The scary forest when we found out that Mark and Emily were gone. That we were all alone in the middle of nowhere with no idea what happened to them. It felt like someone punched me in the stomach. We grabbed our stuff. Quickly. We didn't pack nicely. We just threw everything into our bags as fast as we could. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said. Her voice was shaking because she was scared. "We need to find help." I didn't argue. The scared look in her eyes was the same scared look I had. We didn't know what took Mark and Emily, but we knew we had to get out of that place right away. We left our camping spot in a hurry. The darkness was all around us as we walked to the car. The forest had been so quiet and nice just one day before. Now it felt scary. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something bad. When we got to the car, I tried to use the keys. My hands were shaking so much I could barely open the door. We threw our bags into the back seat and got in. The cold air felt good after being so scared, but when I turned the key to start the car, nothing happened. The car wouldn't start. I tried again, but the engine wouldn't turn on. I felt really scared. My mind started thinking about all the bad things that could happen. The car had been working fine when we got there. There was no reason it shouldn't start now. Come on, I said to myself, turning the key over and over. But the car stayed quiet. "Now what?" Sarah asked. She sounded like she was about to cry. I didn't know what to say. We were many miles from the nearest town. We had no phone service and no way to call for help. The idea of going back to our camping spot and spending another night in those woods was too scary to think about. "We have to walk," I said finally. The words felt heavy. "We have to find help." Sarah nodded. Her face was very pale, but she didn't argue. We took our bags, just the important stuff, and started walking down the dirt road. The darkness was pressing in on us from all sides. The night was quiet. The only sound was our footsteps walking on the small rocks. But sometimes I thought, I heard something else, a soft rustling in the trees, a quiet whisper in the wind. I kept looking over my shoulder. My heart was beating fast because I was scared, but there was nothing there. We walked for hours. The road seemed to go on forever. The forest felt like it was getting closer and tighter with each step. The trees were leaning over us like silent guards. I could feel the weight of the darkness pushing down on us. It made it hard to breathe and hard to think. Then, just when I was starting to lose hope, we saw it. A light that was far away and not very bright. It was flickering through the trees. "Look," Sarah said. Her voice had both hope and fear in it. "Someone's out there." I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, but it was our only choice. We hurried toward the light. Our footsteps got quieter as we got closer. At first, I was too scared to believe it was real. I thought it might be another trick, like the lantern hanging in the middle of the road. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't a lantern at all. The light was coming from a small wooden cabin. It was the clear glow of electric lights cutting through the dark forest. It was a ranger station. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran toward it. We stumbled through the bushes. Our breathing was hard and fast. Relief washed over me like a big wave. The closer we got, the more I let myself believe that we were finally safe, that we had made it. When we reached the station, I banged on the door with all the strength I had left. My knuckles were raw and my voice was rough from shouting. A moment later, the door opened. A park ranger stood there looking at us with surprise and worry. He was an older man, tough and worn out. But right then, he was the most welcome sight I'd ever seen. "What's going on? Are you folks all right?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes looked at us carefully, seeing how scared we were. "We need help," I said, breathing hard. "Our friends, they're gone. We were camping by the lake, and they just disappeared." The ranger's face got serious, but he didn't ask questions. He stepped aside and told us to come in. Inside, the warmth of the station hit us. I could feel my body start to relax. Sarah fell into a chair. Her face was pale and had tear marks on it. I tried to catch my breath. The ranger gave us water and sat across from us. His face looked serious. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. We told him what happened as best as we could. It felt like trying to explain a nightmare that was still happening. We told him about the tapping on the tent and how Mark and Emily disappeared. As I talked, I watched the ranger's face. I expected him not to believe us, but instead there was something else. Something like he had seen this before. When I finished, he stood up and grabbed his radio. "We're going to go back there," he said. Firmly, "I'll call some other rangers to join us. We'll find your friends." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I wasn't sure if there was anything left to find. It didn't take long for two more rangers to arrive, a man and a woman. They were both younger but had the same steady, serious way about them. They listened as the older ranger told them what happened. Their faces were serious but not surprised. We headed back into the woods. The rangers led the way with their powerful flashlights cutting through the trees. I walked with Sarah close by my side. My heart was beating hard in my chest. The forest, which had seemed so full of scary things just hours before, was now very quiet. The trees stood like silent witnesses to everything that had happened. We got to our camping spot in what felt like no time at all. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The tent was still standing. The leftover campfire was cold and dead. But there was no sign of Mark or Emily. No footprints, no broken branches, no clues about where they could have gone. The rangers spread out, looking around. The edge of our campsite. Their lights swept over every inch of the ground. They called out Mark and Emily's names. Their voices echoed through the trees. But there was no answer, no movement. It was like they had just disappeared. The rangers didn't give up easily. Searched for hours, going through the woods and checking every possible direction Mark and Emily could have gone. But there was nothing. No trace of them, not a single sign of them. As the night went on, the truth began to sink in. Mark and Emily were gone. The rangers finally stopped searching. There was nothing more they could do, they told us. But they would send in a bigger team in the morning with more equipment and more people. They would keep looking. But even then, I knew it was pointless. Whatever had taken Mark and Emily wasn't something that could be found with search teams or dogs. It wasn't something that made sense in the world we knew. We left the campsite that night with the rangers, driving back to the nearest town in silence. Sarah stared out the window. Her face was pale and tired. I tried to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation. No logic that could explain how two people could just vanish without a trace. The next day, the rangers went back to the lake with a full team. They searched for days, looking at every inch of the area, but they never found anything. No bodies, no belongings, nothing to suggest where Mark and Emily had gone. The official reports said that they were probably dead, likely victims of an accident in the wilderness. But I knew the truth. I knew that something had taken them, something beyond our understanding. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that it was still out there, hiding in the shadows of that forest, waiting for its next victims. Story 5. We had been planning this trip for weeks. for friends, looking for a bit of adventure before the summer ended and we all went our separate ways for college. The idea was simple: find a remote camping spot, disconnect from the world, and spend a few nights under the stars. It was supposed to be fun, a break from the boring, everyday life. But as I sit here now, trying to piece together what happened, I can't help but wonder if we made a terrible mistake. It all started with a map. Ryan, who called himself an outdoorsman, had found it online. It was a detailed map of a little-known forest deep in the mountains, far from any well-traveled trails. He was the one who talked us into going. "It's supposed to be haunted," he said with a grin, holding up the map like a prize. "You guys up for a little ghost hunting?" I wasn't much of a believer in ghosts, and I'm pretty sure the others weren't either. But the idea of exploring a haunted forest had a certain appeal, especially since we were looking for something different, something exciting. We all laughed it off as a joke, teasing Ryan about his love for creepy stories. But in the end, we agreed it would make for a great story. At the very least, the drive up to the forest was normal. The road wound through thick woods that seemed to grow thicker the further we went. The sun was still high in the sky, casting spotted light through the leaves above. The air was filled with the smell of pine and earth. It was peaceful, almost perfect. I remember thinking that the idea of the forest being haunted was silly. We parked the car at the edge of the forest where the road ended in a small clearing. From there, it was all on foot. We loaded up our backpacks, checked the map one last time, and started our hike into the woods. The trail was narrow, barely more than a footpath winding its way through the trees. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the outside world faded away until all we could hear was the rustle of leaves and the crunch of our boots on the dirt. Ryan led the way, with me and Jess following close behind. Matt brought up the rear, his usual easygoing manner, keeping us all in good spirits. We joked and laughed as we walked, the kind of talking that comes naturally among friends who've known each other forever. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the mood began to change. It started with the feeling of being watched. I can't say exactly when it began, but at some point during the hike, I started to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense that something wasn't right. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, my eyes scanning the trees for anything out of the ordinary. I didn't say anything at first, thinking it was just nerves, or maybe just the eerie atmosphere of the place. But as we kept going, that feeling grew stronger and more urgent. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. Just ahead in the fading light, there was a figure standing among the trees. It was barely visible, little more than a shadowy outline, but it was definitely there. My heart skipped a beat and I stopped walking, staring at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The others stopped and turned to look, but by the time they did, the figure was gone. "See what?" Ryan asked, looking around. "There was someone there," I said, pointing to the spot where I'd seen the figure. "Right there in the trees." Matt laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind you give when you're not entirely sure if something is a joke. "You're just seeing things," he said. "It's getting dark and your mind's playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I'd seen. There had been someone or something standing there, watching us. But the others brushed it off, and we continued on. though the feeling of unease stayed in the back of my mind as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was plunged into darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We made camp in a small clearing, a patch of open ground surrounded by towering trees. The last light of day had faded completely by the time we set up our tents. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of night, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ryan got a fire going. The flames crackled and cast a warm glow that pushed back the darkness. We gathered around it. The tension from earlier slowly melted away as we settled into the familiar routine of setting up camp. Jess and Matt unpacked the food, and soon we were roasting marshmallows and telling stories the way we always did on these trips. But even as we laughed and talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt too quiet, the darkness too thick, pressing in on us from all sides. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement just beyond the reach of the firelight, a flicker of shadow, a brief glimpse of something in the trees. It wasn't until later, when we were sitting around the fire, that the first real sign of trouble appeared. We were deep into one of Ryan's ghost stories, something about a haunted cabin in the woods. The kind of tale that would have seemed silly in any other setting when we heard it. A whisper, faint, barely heard, but there we all stopped talking. At the same time, our heads turning together toward the sound. It seemed to come from the darkness beyond the fire, a soft, breathy voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We nodded, our eyes scanning the darkness, but we couldn't see anything. "It's probably just the wind," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to go back to our conversation, but the mood had changed. The air felt heavy, charged with something we couldn't quite identify. The fire crackled and popped, the only sound in the heavy silence that had settled over the camp. Then we heard it again. The whisper, closer this time, like someone was standing just beyond the circle of light, watching us. "Who's there?" Ryan called out, his voice shaking slightly. There was no answer, just the soft rustling of leaves and the whisper of the wind. But I could feel it now, the presence of something in the darkness, something that was watching us. Matt stood up, grabbing a flashlight from his pack. "I'm going to check it out," he said, but there was a tremor in his voice that told me he was just as scared as the rest of us. "Don't go too far," Jess said, her eyes wide with fear. Matt nodded and turned on the flashlight. He moved toward the edge of the clearing. We watched him go, the firelight casting long shadows across his face, making him look older, more serious than I'd ever seen him. He reached the edge of the clearing and shined the light into the trees. The beam bounced off the trunks and branches, lighting up nothing but darkness. But then the light caught something that made my blood run cold. A shadow with hollow eyes. It was there for only a second, but it was enough to send a wave of terror through me. "Matt," I shouted, my voice shaking. He turned, the flashlight beam swinging wildly as he ran back to the fire. "Did you see that?" he asked, his face pale, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. We all nodded, too scared to speak. The whisper came again, louder this time, almost like a hiss. It was close now, so close that I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Let's get inside the tents," Jess said, her voice trembling. We scrambled into our tents, zipping them up tight. The thin fabric was the only barrier between us and whatever was out there. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with what I'd seen. That shadow, it wasn't human. It couldn't be, but it had been there, staring at us from the darkness, watching us with those hollow eyes. And the whisper, it wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, the forest seemed different. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. But the warmth that usually came with a new day was missing. The air was thick, heavy, and the feeling of being watched lingered even in the light of day. We didn't talk much as we broke camp, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the night before. Ryan tried to make light of it, joking about how we'd let a few spooky sounds get to us, but his laughter sounded hollow, forced. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us wanted to be the first to say it. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes kept drifting to the edge of the clearing, to the spot where Matt had seen that face. The memory of it sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, unnervingly. "So, we should get out of here," Jess said quietly, breaking the silence. We all nodded in agreement, the unspoken fear settling over us like a heavy blanket. The idea of spending another night in that forest was unbearable, and we all felt it, the need to leave, to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. We started down the trail, the path winding through the trees, but the sense of unease only grew stronger the further we went. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The silence was oppressive, the only sounds our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, we saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the path, blocking our way. My heart lurched in my chest as I recognized it. The same face I'd seen the night before, pale and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The figure stood there, motionless, watching us. Ryan was the first to react. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, fading into the air like smoke. I blinked, unable to believe what I was seeing. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, leaving nothing but the empty path ahead. "What the hell was that?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling. None of us had an answer. We stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the figure had been, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation, no rational way to process what we'd seen. Finally, Jess spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper, "We need to go." Now, we didn't argue. We started walking again, our pace quickening as the fear began to take hold. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows longer, the trees more menacing. The path that had seemed so clear before now felt like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Then the whispering started again. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur in the background, but it grew louder with each step. We took until it was all we could hear, the same breathy voice, repeating the same words over and over. Words we couldn't understand, but that filled us with a deep, primal fear. We started to run, our footsteps pounding on the dirt path, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right in our ears, surrounding us, suffocating us. I could see the fear in my friend's eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at my insides. We didn't know what was happening, didn't know what we were running from, but we knew we had to get away. Had to escape this cursed forest before it was too late. Then, as we rounded another bend in the trail, we saw the car. It was parked just ahead in the clearing where we'd left it. The sunlight glinting off the metal like a beacon of hope. We sprinted the last few yards, our hearts pounding with relief as we reached the car and threw our packs inside. But just as Ryan fumbled with the keys, something caught my eye. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, was the figure. It was watching us, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me, and I yanked open the car door. Diving inside as Ryan started the engine, the tires spun on the gravel, kicking up dust as we sped out of the clearing, the forest disappearing behind us. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. If these stories made your skin crawl, don't forget to hit that like button and share the chills with your friends. Subscribe for more terrifying tales and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment of horror. Have a creepy camping experience of your own. Drop it in the comments. We're all ears. Remember, the wilderness holds secrets, and sometimes it's better not to explore them alone. Stay safe and keep watching for more spine-tingling stories. See you in the next nightmare.